welcome to the May edition of The Coffee House, where in the next hour, medical marijuana in Maryland, a patient who says she gets pain relief from pot, and a Republican lawmaker who won't just say no. The D.C. police lock up the Coffee House film crew at the Mobilization for Global Justice rally. Also, how the Drug Czar snuck anti-drug messages into primetime TV shows and why the story quickly disappeared. Plus, mandolin and guitar talent Robin Bullock, a Miriam Morsel Nathan poem, and Ethelbert Miller on his new memoir, Fathering Words, the Making of an African-American Writer. Hi, and welcome to the Coffee House. Carrie wanted to quit driver's education. Her mom and dad said, "No way." That angered Carrie. She picked up a camera and secretly shot some photos of her Tacoma Park basement, including her mom's pot plants, and handed the pictures over to the police. That was in December. Her mom, Kitty, and dad were arrested. They pleaded guilty to misdemeanor drug offenses. Both got suspended sentences. Dad lost his job. Kitty lost access to her pot, which she says provides relief from her migraines and a neuromuscular disorder. Should marijuana be available as medicine? Many cancer, HIV, and glaucoma patients smoke pot as a painkiller. And a recent study on rats found that marijuana actually reduces gliomas, an especially aggressive and usually fatal form of brain cancer. In 1998, D.C. voters overwhelmingly approved a medical marijuana referendum, but Congress blocked its implementation. Polls show that most Marylanders also favor allowing certain patients to use marijuana as medicine. Still, Republican delegate Donald Murphy's bill to legalize medical marijuana went down to defeat in the Maryland General Assembly this year. We'll look at why and at the prospects that Kitty Tucker and other patients may someday legally smoke pot to control their pain. Welcome both of you to the Coffee House.
Thank you.
Kitty, let's start with you. Could you briefly describe the nature of your ailments and how you treat them, or how you did treat them?
About 12 years ago, I fell ill with an unexplained disorder, which 2 or 3 years later, I read in a newspaper the symptoms were being described as chronic fatigue immune deficiency syndrome. By this point, I was having daily migraine headaches, sometimes more than one migraine headache a day. The headaches were ferocious, and they kept me in bed much of the time. Eventually, over the years, I had a number of other problems diagnosed, but the ones that have continued to haunt me are constant daily migraine headaches, fibromyalgia, which is a neuromuscular disorder, and chronic fatigue immune deficiency syndrome. These illnesses are chronic. They are not going to go away. When I was only 19 years old, I was a lucky cancer survivor, so I'm very grateful that I've reached my 50s. People didn't expect me to really live this long. And at the time that the police confiscated my little basement garden, I had a medical journal article which explained why cannabis can help with a migraine headache. And in fact, back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, tincture of cannabis was the main treatment for chronic headaches.
And was that your main treatment as well for chronic headaches?
I'm using a variety of
Before
then, I was already using a variety of Western medicines and also using Eastern therapies like acupuncture to try and cope with the daily pain. And by using the marijuana, the pain ranges from annoying to suicidal, and it was able to keep me from feeling suicidal when I was able to use the drug. When they took the marijuana away, I suffered more vomiting, migraines, and had great difficulty eating. The same kind of things that AIDS wasting syndrome for people with advanced stages of AIDS have suffered.
The Food and Drug Administration has never found marijuana to be safe and effective as a medicine.
Because they've never really studied it.
And the Drug Enforcement Administration has scheduled marijuana as a Schedule I drug, which means that it has no known or recognized medicinal use.
Well, that's based on a 1970 law that is really based on a lie. there was extensive use. In fact, marijuana is an ancient herbal remedy. It's been used on every continent, and they are now finding records that go back hundreds of years documenting its use for a variety of illnesses. Instead of acting like modern people and saying, well, let's subject marijuana to some studies and see what it really works well for now that we have other alternatives, we've turned our back on this ancient herbal remedy. And the only aspect that's allowed to be sold is Marinol, which has been
we're going to come back to
monopolized by one particular drug company.
We'll come back to that in a minute. Right now in Maryland, if you are arrested for simple possession of marijuana, you're subject to up to a year in prison and a $1,000 fine. Delegate Murphy, a poll recently was taken by the University of Maryland that found that 73% of Maryland citizens would favor some kind of legislation to allow at least certain people to take marijuana. And last year, the National Academy of Sciences Institute of Medicine issued a report in a federally funded study indicating that marijuana should be available for at least some patients. The Clinton administration Drug Czar, however, Barry McCaffrey, takes the view that medical marijuana is essentially a way of getting a foot in the door for marijuana legalization. Let me read you a quote. Care to respond to that?
Well, it may be a way for some people to get this issue out into the public and to have people believe that marijuana is okay. I think marijuana is okay as medicine, and I think at some point children would believe that marijuana's use is only for medicine and associate it with cancer patients and AIDS patients and the like. And maybe that would do more to suppress and reduce the amount of people using marijuana than all the things we've tried so far. That notwithstanding, the fact that people are suffering, they should not be left to suffer just because some people think this is part of a bigger agenda. It's certainly not part of my agenda, and I think we need to err on the side of the people who are ill.
Kitty mentioned that there's other drugs like Marinol, which is synthetic THC, which is the psychoactive ingredient in marijuana that is available, and the Drug Czar says that is the real medical marijuana. People object to it, say, well, some people aren't able to swallow, and the Drug Czar comes back and says, well, you can inhale it or take a suppository. The marketplace will provide for that if there's enough of demand. What about that?
Well, the testimony that we had during the bill hearing suggested that 85% of people would benefit from using the smoked marijuana, as compared to about a third who benefit from the Marinol. It's real simple. There are people who don't take the Marinol well, and until something else is available, I think the state of Maryland should treat people differently when they are using marijuana for medical purposes than when they're using it for abusive purposes. It's real simple. You shouldn't go to jail. It shouldn't be the policy of the state to arrest and incarcerate people and their caregivers for attempting to alleviate their own pain and suffering.
Let's take a look at your bill in particular. Tell us what it provides.
It would just make a distinction between the criminal penalties for medical marijuana use. It would allow patients and their caregivers, those people who are over the age of 18, when they have a doctor's recommendation. Now, the doctor can't prescribe, and that's understood, but this allows the justice system, the state, to know that there aren't people out there using this as just a reason to use marijuana. That they can say, oh, my doctor says, well, you've got to have a doctor's recommendation. There are a number of different ways we could have handled this. There's also an enhanced penalty if you try and push yourself off as someone who is using marijuana with a doctor's note, and you don't have one. There's an enhanced penalty for that. So, this bill could have worked if
Why didn't it pass?
Well, because there wasn't the will to do it yet. And frankly, while I had a lot of calls from constituents and people outside of my district, I don't know that the legislators on my committee got the same amount of pressure. and understanding. And I think what we need to do is everyone who has a story to tell, if they call their own delegates and tell it, we have a dozen people call each delegate. This bill passes. It's that simple.
Kitty, your experience with Marinol, does it do the trick for you? Does it relieve your pain?
When my doctor prescribed the Marinol for me, I was able to begin eating again, and before that it was a chore. And then gradually the vomiting migraines stopped. So that aspect of the Marinol has been very helpful. But I suspect that there are many other psychoactive ingredients in smoked marijuana, and I suspect that some of those other ingredients, from what I learned at the recent medical marijuana conference held at the University of Iowa, is that some of these other ingredients have some other beneficial effects for muscle spasticity, which is the other part of my problem. Fibromyalgia is an unexplained problem with the neurons and muscles, and it leads to what we sort of call a whole body ache. And the marijuana was very beneficial for that, and I don't get that same effect from the pharmaceutical.
The marijuana has many more active ingredients than just the Marinol, and the Marinol I think just has one. And I'll tell you, when I started this whole issue, I didn't even know how to spell marijuana. I can't keep up with Kitty at all on the active ingredients and the chemicals and how it works. I'm not a doctor, and that's the point.
You are a legislator.
Yes, but nobody sitting on that committee is a doctor.
Would your bill cover Kitty Tucker's situation?
I don't. The way it was drafted, I'm not sure that it would. You know, we specified cancer, AIDS, glaucoma, and multiple sclerosis, and epilepsy, and then any other condition for which the health department would have allowed that use. So migraines were not listed specifically in the bill.
Migraines were specifically listed in the California legislation, and they mentioned for pain relief.
That legislation passed?
Yes. I think that the Hawaiian bill was very similar to the California bill, but I think that whoever was charged to enforce this would be able to use their common sense. I think that our doctors today have a chance to learn things more quickly than they did a century ago. So that as studies are printed, we can learn more about what works.
We're running out of time, and I just wanted to get at the dynamic between the federal and state enforcement authorities here, because even if all the states pass medical marijuana laws, if the federal government continues to enforce marijuana as simply a criminal activity, then it's possible that people will be arrested even if the states allow it. There's an election coming up in November. Al Gore's sister is famous for having smoked marijuana to treat her cancer, pain from her cancer. Gore's indicated that he would support medical marijuana. George W. Bush has said that he would leave it up to the states to decide. Do you think we're about to turn the corner, Delegate Murphy, on the question of medical marijuana nationally?
I think we're one election away. And I think the states need to put the pressure on. Yes, it's still a federal crime, but the feds don't prosecute. 90-some% of all the prosecutions are made by the state. And we have many laws that are federal laws that the state does not impose and does not prosecute for. So that was one of the big stumbling blocks that legislators sort of hung their hat on and said, well, I can't vote for this because the federal law. I don't have a vote at the federal level. I only have a vote at the state level. So the way we're going to do this is by pushing the feds harder. The more states that do it, the more difficulty they're going to have keeping this a federal crime.
Well, thanks to Maryland Delegate Donald Murphy and to Tacoma resident Kitty Tucker for joining us in the coffee house, and best of luck to you on your continuing efforts to change the law. Still ahead, why the story went away of how the networks got a federal subsidy to inject anti-drug messages into their programs. We've got a Miriam Morsel Nathan poem and guitar and mandolin pickin' from Robin Bullock, plus Ethelbert Miller talks about his new memoir. But first, our Steve Olson took his camera to the Mobilization for Global Justice demonstrations on April 15th. Little did he expect what was to follow.
I was filming a segment for Tacoma Coffee House on Saturday the 15th of April. After filming some initial shots at the White House, we happened to cross a demonstration that was forming. The protesters were going down Pennsylvania Avenue and reached George Washington University, where they were abruptly turned around by police. Protesters were ultimately turned onto 20th Street under police escort. And while going down that street on the hill, they encountered a row of baton holding policemen who prevented the demonstration, which consisted of about 1,000 people, from proceeding any further.
We just ended our rally, and we're trying to leave. And we're here on the sidewalk. Let the media acknowledge we are on the sidewalk trying to end a peaceful rally. Was this rally peaceful? Yeah. I mean, there wasn't an element of violence, but those are the people surrounding us. They got guns and clubs, but we don't have guns and clubs. We're here exercising our right for a peaceful protest. And you can't really get much more peaceful than we were given the crimes committed by the IMF. Am I right? Let us go! No more delays! Let us go! No more delays!
The crowd of protesters were not communicated to in any way, although there were literally hundreds of policemen surrounding the group of demonstrators who were locked in. We found out that we were under arrest by one of the protest leaders. I was filming with a 3-member crew, my friend and her daughter, 13. And once I was aware that the arrest was about to occur, I made 3 attempts to tell the police that we're a film crew working for a valid public access television show and that we should be freed. After being confined on the street for approximately 2 hours, the group was gradually loaded. Usually about 8 people were arrested at a time, all lined up, and loaded onto awaiting buses. At no point during the time when the 1,000 were locked in was there any formal police announcement that we were either conducting an illegal demonstration, any illegal acts of any sort.
Don't know what's going on. They haven't told us what we're being penned here for. They're putting people in buses back there. I really have no idea what's going on, but I have everybody's number, possibly need on my arm. So if anything happens, everyone knows it. God bless America.
During the time that we were being processed for arrest, we were bound with plastic handcuffs, and despite our requests to find out what we were being charged with, the police answered with no response at all. And nor did they inform us of our Miranda rights, since we were obviously being placed under arrest. They were all put on buses. I noted about 11 buses outside the D.C. jail next to the D.C. General Hospital. The people who were arrested made numerous requests for food and water, which were all denied and ignored. I have a number of disabilities that requires medical attention and medication. And after about 2 hours of being on the bus, I notified the officer that I required my medication. One is post-back surgery. I've had 4 back surgeries, and I have to take pain medication approximately every 2 hours. After a couple of hours of being held, I notified the officer that I needed to take some medication immediately, and I requested a doctor, and that I had disabilities and I needed some special consideration. Response was basically, if I took my medication, I would be charged with possession of narcotics. My biggest concern was the 13-year-old who was helping produce the segment. While she was incarcerated only until about midnight, which was fortunate, while in detention, she was told that she was going to be detained for 1 year and that she would not be able to talk with her mother until the end of 1 year. The time that we were first detained on the street until I was released was approximately 16 hours. Ultimately, I was charged with parading without a permit. Taping this the following Friday after the incident. Physically, I'm still recovering from the ordeal. My shoulders hurt. My hands are still swollen. My back is very painful, and I've already spent 3 days in bed since the arrest.
It's a blue blur on her arm while she reaches across the table for a fig. You don't see it at first. You think your eyes are playing tricks, that there's a smudge, must be some ink from a letter she was writing to one of her unaccented kids in some American city with a McDonald's on every other corner. She reaches over again and you look hard, and then you see it. It makes you think maybe you should drop a note to her kid and say, I saw your mother and she's okay, and I guess you know this, but somehow she can't get rid of that tattoo. And then you want to say to that kid, you must have spent your childhood trying to rub it off.
Hi, and welcome to a second look at the Coffee House. You may have raised an eyebrow a while ago when it was reported that the major TV networks were being subsidized by a federal government anti-drug program to promote those messages during prime time. Very sneaky, you might have thought. Well, how is this for sneaky? The same big city newspapers that disclosed this little scandal in the first place forgot to mention that they too received benefits from the same program. Yes, one of those kettle and pot situations. We now know the whole story thanks to one of the new players in the new media, the internet that is. David Weir, an editor with the website that put it all together, Salon.com, is here to explain. David, welcome to the Coffee House.
Thank you, Howard.
I keep wanting to call Salon a magazine. In fact, it used to be called a magazine, but that's old-fashioned, right?
Well, it's called Salon.com. You know, I think the new media isn't going to be new if we call it by the same words as we know old media. So we know what we're not, but we don't know what we are yet.
Well, Salon is you punch in Salon.com, and there it is on the internet. So,
and that's part of the reason for the name change,
right,
basically, because that's the URL, and that's sort of the branding statement, as it were.
Is it updated 24 hours a day? Or do you
not
actually
not quite 24 hours a day, or, you know, all my hair would fall out besides being white. But it is updated surprisingly frequently now. It used to be a magazine, essentially. It was daily, a daily magazine, or like a newspaper. But now you have stories launching on Salon as early as 7 a.m. here on the East Coast, 6, 7, 8 a.m. And then throughout the day as things come in, mainly wire copy, but also original stories, really can launch at any time. There's no technical reason it can't be 7 by 24. It's just human beings, no lives.
But this is really an old-fashioned story on a new media. It's an investigative piece telling, you know, pulling the covers back off of the Washington Post and the New York Times in this case, right? What was the essence was that there was a federal anti-drug program trying to get out that message, maybe a good message, but dubious methods.
Yeah, basically the Drug Czar's office had a deal of floating a lot of advertising and demanding that the networks, in return the television networks, provide it at a 50% discount. And the way that deal was supposed to work is they would buy anti-drug time, and then the network would donate one free message. Now, this changed when the networks, you know, their ad inventory shrunk a bit, and they saw this was a big giveaway of a lot of money to them. So they approached the Drug Czar and said, hey, how about if we like let you see our shows, you know, like ER and NYPD and so forth, and let maybe, you know, there'll be anti-drug messaging in the programs. It'll be more effective. And the Drug Czar said, sure. And so that whole thing broke into a huge scandal. We broke that scandal in January. Then what you said happened. And actually Howard Kurtz, the media critic at the Post, deserves credit for this. To his credit, he exposed the fact that the Times and the Post, both of which played this story, our story, as front page news, were themselves taking the same deal. Now the way they did it is, I believe the Times published a whole series, thousands and thousands, of anti-drug pamphlets for the schools in New York, combining content from the New York Times. The Post did it a little differently. They did a banner ad linking from the website. But one way or another way, and then by the way, in April we did another expose about magazines, U.S. News and World Report and a whole slew of magazines do the same deal.
Taking the same money.
Taking the same money and submitting content for credit so they don't have to do that second free ad. So you see, in many ways, the whole thing is a financial arrangement.
And where does it cross the line?
Where it crosses the line is many people believe that the government has no business getting involved in what the messaging inside any media is. And if we allow this to happen, even, as you say, a message we might agree with. Who wants kids on drugs? Certainly none of the people criticizing this program. But it's a slippery slope. And you know yourself from your years in journalism that the worst threat to journalism is self-censorship. It's what you know you ought not to do. And when editors know $1 million is hanging in the balance over here for a certain kind of drug story, what are they going to do, you know? So I think the whole relationship between the Drug Czar and the media is highly problematic from a First Amendment point of view and from the concept of preserving the integrity of media.
Okay, all right. Well, does the internet now, the .com media, position itself as sort of a new watchdog? You have fewer sacred cows to worry about.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we've both been journalists a long time. I'm cynical enough to know that every media has its sacred cows. I mean, you don't see internet sites criticizing their owners or their, you know, largest advertisers very often. But I do think there's a new kind of accountability altogether. And it's not so much because of a superior cut of media on the internet as it is with interactivity. The people actually holding us accountable are the readers. The minute you publish a piece, your email box gets flooded, hundreds of letters. And believe me, if there's a mistake in there, you hear about it.
Yeah,
so yes.
So there's an immediate give and take.
Immediate, and that's interactivity, you know? It goes, comes back and forth. The CNN story last year, what was it called? Tailwind, about the scandal in Southeast Asia. CNN claimed that the U.S. had sprayed drugs and so forth. That was organized on the internet. The blowback on that was from all the veterans that said, did you ever hear of that? No. Did you? No. And before you knew it, CNN had backed down. That was an internet-based organizational challenge to the media. And that was more significant than our drug story in terms of showing the power of the internet.
A really interesting kind of checks and balance that didn't exist a couple of years ago.
We're more of a filter for communities than we are a broadcast method. Right. So it's not like television or radio. We don't broadcast a stream to the audience. We participate with the audience. In fact, a quarter of Salon's content is created by the audience, not by the editors, through Table Talk, The Well. These are the chat areas, email, letters, all that stuff.
But you're also doing a few traditional things. You're covering the presidential races. Politics are big on.
We're reporters. You know, it wouldn't be any fun if we didn't get to do politics. I mean, what could be more fun than the John McCain race? That was like just great for the press. It's pretty boring right now, actually, with Gush and Bohr. But yeah, we're covering the political scene.
Gush, was that a Freudian slip there?
It could have been possible. Been known to do them. But yeah, and you know, again, both of us share this tradition. Investigative reporting. It's just something that I think is the best of journalism, to go out and do community-based investigative reporting. So Salon does a bit of that too.
But you liked McCain personally, and Salon seemed to like McCain, but you also then published a story about there was slavery in his family past.
That was a really interesting moment. You know, as a professional journalist, I really liked McCain, and it's obvious why so many of us did. He granted access. You know, it's like the Praetorian Guard around Bush and Gore. You've got to, you know, you got to penetrate layers and layers to get to ask a question. With McCain, he'll take any question. And, but it's not like we wanted to do PR for the man. He's still a candidate. We do our job. We heard him give a speech saying, it was about the South Carolina flag issue. That's where this came up, that he had a proud military tradition in his past, but luckily nobody was a slaveholder. Well, we went in and showed him the slave rolls with the names of the 52 slaves that his great-great-great-grandfather had owned, the very man he had celebrated as a military hero in Mississippi. One of the most interesting parts of that story is that he may be related to Mississippi John Hurt, the great blues singer. Turns out Mississippi John Hurt was born on McCain's plantation, and his mother's name was Susan McCain. That's one piece of this puzzle that hasn't been totally pinned down. Maybe rumor level, but you know the internet's good for that too. Look at Matt Drudge.
So should McCain have run as an independent? I know he's not going to.
You know, I think the McCain
question.
phenomenon actually is the most interesting thing about this year politically. I can't get over the fact that this is closely related to the Jesse Ventura case in Minnesota. The mayor's race in San Francisco, interestingly enough, this year, where a completely, you know, unannounced write-in candidate forced a runoff at the last minute, and then the McCain national race. All of these things are about people challenging the system as it works. Politics as usual, out. And mark my words, although McCain probably won't be back in, the McCain factor will affect the outcome of this election somehow.
What I'm interested in is 4 years from now when the .com factor affects politics. I think there's some big influence that'll come down the pike.
Well, I think your questions conflate because the McCain factor is in fact an internet factor. He raised so much money on the web, but more his attitude represents the attitude. You might have noticed McCain, who's an ideological conservative, attracted liberals. I wonder what that's about. I never heard so many people say, you know, I don't know if I really agree with him, I just like him. People think that's his personal appeal. Well, he's an appealing guy, but he's not that appealing, you know. You know, a lot of them are appealing.
Great.
The thing is that he represents challenging the status quo, and that's the attitude on the net.
Let's leave it there. We're out of time. Thanks to David Weir for joining us in the coffee house. For all of you, it's time to learn new habits. No more fumbling with the newspaper over your morning paper. Your morning coffee, put that mug down next to your computer and log on. I'm Howard Kohn, and this has been A Second Look.
Still ahead, Ethelbert Miller's new memoir. But first,
Well, Robin.
Hello, Dave.
I'd like to welcome you to the musical traditions segment of the Coffee House.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
I know what that instrument is, and you know what that instrument is, but we should let our viewers at home who are sitting there wondering, well, it kind of looks like the head of a mandolin, but the body's too big and the neck's too long. And so what is this?
It goes by a number of different names. Some people call it a bouzouki because that's the name of the Greek instrument that it most closely resembles. Some people call it an octave mandolin because it is, in fact, an octave below a mandolin.
Now, the bouzouki would be round back.
A bouzouki would have a true Greek bouzouki, yes, would have a bowl back and a slightly longer, skinnier neck. This is sometimes called an Irish bouzouki.
Right, and of course the theory by making it a flat back was sort of the Orville Gibson idea of turning round backs into flat backs so they're easier to hold.
Different sort of sound.
They don't pivot on your body.
Yeah, they don't slide off your lap while you're playing them quite so easily. And a different sort of sound, a more brilliant sound, a louder sound. It's sometimes called a cittern as well, which is the Renaissance instrument that it most closely resembles. So I use the names pretty much interchangeably. You know, I find it's advisable not to call it a bouzouki if you're walking through an airport with it.
Yeah, don't want to slow the word at that point.
No, definitely not.
Yeah, we'll scan that one, right?
But it's used in Irish and Scottish music a great deal. It's kind of a recent arrival in that tradition, but fits right in. And
works.
I've always just, you know, I played guitar and mandolin before I discovered this, and I just fell in love with the sound.
This was made over in England, right?
This was made by the great instrument maker Stephen Sobel in Northumberland, England, yes. Yeah. I'm very lucky to have it. It's a great instrument.
So I guess you would, at this point in your career, be a Celtic-inspired, rather than just a straight Celtic musician.
Yes, exactly. I've played, you know, I've put in a lot of years playing the straight stuff, traditional Irish and Scottish music, but also traditional American music. I played bluegrass before I discovered Irish music.
That's right. I have heard you play a little 5-string banjo.
Yeah. Oh, now you've blown my cover.
Sorry.
Don't want people to know.
Okay.
But, no, as the old joke goes, I'm the definition of a gentleman. I can play the banjo, but I don't.
Ah, yes.
But at any rate,
what was that tune that you played?
Well, that was actually that's a good example of where I'm going these days, trying to combine the Celtic influence and the American influence. The first tune was a French-Canadian tune, creatively titled Old French.
Okay.
A traditional tune. And the second was an Irish reel called Miss Monahan, a very well-known, well-loved Irish tune. And they just seem to fit together, even though they come from different sides of the ocean. Yeah.
Very cool. Okay. Well, you brought a guitar.
I brought a guitar.
What are you going to play on guitar?
Well, on guitar, I'm going to play a new tune, a new composition of mine that's sort of, again, inspired by the traditional Celtic tune forms, but hopefully going in a
So I guess that answers the question too. Do you write any of your own
material? I do. I write quite a bit. Well, it's just, you know, finding inspiration in the traditions and trying to build something new from them.
Take it away.
So,
thank you.
As soon as I gather up the finger picks that I've scattered all over the floor here, there we are. This is a new tune of mine, as I said. And this is called The Secret Waterfall.
writer's block at the coffee house. The memoir can be like an exorcism. In its construction, the writer must confront the past. Old ghosts are resurrected, and skeletons come rattling out of the closet, and ancestors from the spirit world take on new flesh and blood. They come alive on the page. E. Ethelbert Miller demonstrates the process in his new book, Fathering Words, The Making of an African-American Writer. He excavates his childhood, his father's West Indian background, and the experience of other family members. He exercises old pain and loss, clearing the way for new life, opportunity, and joy. And along the way, he explains his own birth as a writer. E. Ethelbert Miller is a poet and author. His work appears in 5 collections of poetry, and he has also edited numerous anthologies. He is the director of the African American Resource Center at Howard University, and he is a familiar face here at the Coffee House. He lives in Tacoma, D.C. Welcome to the Coffee House.
Oh, thank you very much.
Or I should say welcome back to the
Thank
Coffee
you.
House, Ethelbert. You know, speaking of ghosts and apparitions, you have one at the start of this book. When you describe your brother's death,
Sure.
would you?
Well, you know what happened is, I think this book is a very spiritual book, and my brother was a very interesting person. If there's one person I felt could come back and visit, it would probably be my brother. And at his wake, a woman came up to me at the wake and said that she had seen my brother the day after he had died, and I thought that was very interesting. And I think that's the beginning of a story, the beginning of the book, actually.
Well, you have several images in this book that are sort of out of chronological order, shall we say, or reality, real life
Hypertext.
order. Yes, that are happening on sorts of levels. And in the course of your brother's death, you also describe your father's death.
Right. You know, I think that in every household you're affected by certain births, certain deaths, and to have my brother die first, which sort of threw the order of leaving out. That affected me, and then to have my father shortly after die, and then to be the baby of the family and look around and all of a sudden the men in the family are gone. That was something that I reflected on. It was something that took me a long time to accept and understand.
Oh, I'm sure. And these two losses, and then your own sort of creation. I mean, you by then were a writer.
Right, I was a writer, and what I try to do in this book is to look back as well as look forward. So at the same time, it's me being born and looking at my father and looking at my brother. It's also me being a father, and all of this is tied in with being an artist. This sort of giving birth to oneself, which is very interesting, and the sacrifice that we have to make for our children as well as for our art.
Well, and when you say giving birth, you also have another voice in this book besides your own, which is
my sister Marie.
Your sister Marie.
I had to create my sister's voice because being the baby of the family, I was not aware of the family I was born into, and also it was easy for me to do because in many of my poems I use a female persona, and so I really felt comfortable. But I started out trying to explain and try to understand my family, my father, my brother, my mother, my sister, before I was born into that family unit. And once I began to discover some of the early stories, I decided to keep it. And my sister's voice sort of is woven into the text.
Okay. Would you read us a little bit?
I'll read you the beginning of Fathering Words. This is chapter 1. It makes reference to the ghost that you talked about. The day after my brother died, Carmen, one of his neighbors, said she saw him walking his dog. My brother Richard, who had changed his name to Francis, loved animals, and so he took the name of the saint he loved. Growing up in the South Bronx, it was important to believe in something, and so my brother made the decision to believe in God. I met God one afternoon on Longwood Avenue in the Bronx. It must have been around 1958, and I was attending PS 39, which was located near streets like Beck, Kelly, and Fox. Longwood Avenue was the big street, and I was not permitted to cross it alone. I was in one of those grades in school where you took naps and the teachers gave you cookies when you were good. On the day I met God, I had been standing on the corner for almost an hour, afraid to cross Longwood Avenue. All my school friends were gone, and I was alone with cars passing by and the dark evening creeping in like one of my sister's boyhood lovers. I was afraid to cross the street without holding someone's hand, and so I did something my brother was good at doing. I started praying to God. I asked God to come for me, to help me cross the big street. If he did, I promised I would be good for the rest of my life. I would never steal or lie. I closed my eyes and only opened them when I heard my father running across the street, cursing and trying to fix his clothes at the same time. When I was little, I thought my father was God. And that opens the book.
Very good, yeah. And it's also fathering words, then it's your father's God, but there is also you as artist.
Me as artist, and in between there is my brother, because the whole search in terms of this dream of me being an artist, I think is tied in with my brother's dream. Within my household, I felt that there was a lot of loss, a lot of dreams which were not fulfilled. In the case of my brother, wanted to stay in the monastery in the early 60s, and I felt that my mother sort of manipulated him out, and so he gave up that dream. He was always very supportive of me becoming a writer and living in Washington, D.C., because he felt I had escaped my mother's hands, and to some extent I think he was very accurate about this. And so I try to weave these stories together.
So you fathered words, you became a writer. You also fathered children, unlike your brother and sister.
Right.
You were the baby
Sure.
who got out of the house
Sure.
and who went off. And yeah, you've got all these metaphors in this book in terms of creation and sort of rearing, not just rearing children, but rearing books, rearing institutions.
Sure.
Howard University
Sure.
is an institution.
And there's a lot of people in here who, and I mentioned them, who are writers who I feel I was helpful to their career.
Yes.
And so they were helpful for me. Also, I'm one of those writers, I guess someone like Marita Golden, who we changed our names, and that giving birth to ourselves, reinventing oneself. I think that's also here in this text.
It's also the narrative, and this is a very African-American way of writing. I mean, it goes way, way back. Did you feel that as you were writing it, or?
I wrote this book very fast. I felt that this, out of anything I've done, that this was a gift. I felt that when people say, okay, did you go and talk to people, doing research? No, this was something where I just sat down. It sort of like came to me, so like revelation. And I was amazed at how quickly I had completed it. And then what I was very happy about is once it had been submitted to the publisher, my editor decided that, when she told me, she said, no rewrites, that it was pretty much the way it had come in. And that's very rare for a book to stand on its own.
Absolutely. You also talk quite a bit about marriage.
Talk about marriage,
your parents' marriage, your own marriages.
My own marriages, I've been fortunate, I think, to be married twice. My first wife, my second wife are very good friends. And I learned from both women, Fathering Words is dedicated to 4 women who I feel are responsible for mothering this book. And when I look at the role that women play in my life, I think it's been a very positive role. At the same time, I have to contrast those women next to my mother. And so where my mother was very manipulative, in terms of, this is how you're going to be. Even in some of my marriages, I've seen that, and I've had to, rebel against that. At the same time, being true to my father's wisdom and guidance, and that you have to make sacrifices. And my father made a sacrifice.
Yes, tell that.
Right. I talk about how my father could left my mother. And I know my mother will be interested when she reads this. I don't remember that conversation. But what happens is I always remember that. I always remember being in bed, my father saying that.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize until like being a father now what that meant. Those are those stories.
And say it again. What exactly?
My father said he could left my mother.
And you were a child.
I was a
you
child.
Were with him on the,
in the bed. I remember that, watching like Gunsmoke or Bonanza or something like that, something terrorizing. And you don't realize what that means, that a simple, expression like that, that if, for example, he was to follow through, would totally change your life.
Right.
And we can see in terms of how many men, go out the door and don't come back, for maybe selfish reasons or whatever. But in this case, my father was aware of that. He could have done that.
Yes.
But he decided to stay because he had responsibilities. And this whole thing in terms of putting the happiness in his family first.
Right.
Now, I've always wrestled with that because going through more marriages than my father, I could look at my first marriage in which I was very heartbroken, and I had placed a person first. And after that first marriage, that fell apart with Michelle. I said, I'm never going to do that again. You know, my word comes first. And I used to tell people that I might leave a woman. So a woman might leave me, but my work's not going to leave me.
Right.
You know, I might leave my work.
And that's
you know,
right.
and so that was a thing that I had to learn and wrestle with. And I just go back to the lessons of that I was given by my father in terms of what it means to be a man, what it means to be an African-American man, what it means to be a person who provides for his family. There are certain sacrifices. Now I have to look at how I make those sacrifices, not only as a father and as a husband, but also as an artist.
Yes.
And what's going to be my priority.
Very good. Well, thank you. We've got about 10 seconds left. So, Ethelbert, it was a pleasure to read. It was really great. Thanks to Ethelbert Miller for joining me in the Coffee House. Again, his new memoir is called Fathering Words, The Making of an African-American Writer. I'm Lisa Page, and this has been Writer's Block.
That's it for the May edition. See you next month in the Coffee House.